On a Thursday morning in June of 1971, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Macon County, Illinois, a 63-year-old farmer named Howard Beckett walked to the far end of the auction lot and stood in front of something that nobody else had looked at twice. It was a 1937 Oliver 70 row crop model. The Oliver 70 had been one of the finest tractors of its era, a machine that had changed what farmers expected from their equipment when it rolled off the line in Charles City, Iowa, 34 years earlier. Streamlined hood, six-cylinder engine, smooth, quiet power that had earned it the nickname the Silhouette among farmers who appreciated the things worth appreciating. This one did not look like any of those things. The green paint had gone to rust in every place where metal met weather. The front tires had rotted off the rims entirely. The rear rubber was cracked through, useless. The hood had a long dent across the top, the kind that comes from something heavy falling on it from above. The seat was gone. The steering wheel had cracked down the middle. Weeds had grown up through the drawbar hitch and dried there, woven into the old iron like the land itself was trying to claim it back. A handwritten tag on the steering column read, 1937 Oliver. As is. No known running condition. Last operated approximately 1958. 13 years idle. I am 34 years old. A machine that the auction catalog had listed under the heading Scrap and Salvage. Howard Beckett stood in front of it for 11 minutes. The auctioneer had timed sales to run every 4 minutes on average, which meant Howard stood through nearly 3 other lots without moving. His wife Margaret, who had come to the sale looking for a set of canning jars she'd heard might be in the household goods, found him there and stood beside him for a moment, before asking what he was looking at. That, Howard said. Margaret looked at Oliver. That's a pile of rust. I know what it is. Howard, we don't need a pile of rust. I know that too. Margaret studied her husband's face. She had been married to him for 31 years, long enough to recognize the expression he wore when he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the moment to act on it. She went to find her canning jars. When the Oliver came up in the rotation, the auctioneer gave it exactly the enthusiasm it appeared to deserve. All right, folks, last of the equipment lots. 1937 Oliver 70, row crop. She's been sitting since Eisenhower's first term. Tires are gone, seats gone. Don't know about the engine. Somebody give me $25 for the iron weight alone. Howard raised his hand. 25. Do I hear 30? Silence. 25 going once. 25 going twice. 40, Howard said. The auctioneer blinked. $40 for a non-running 1937 Oliver with no tires and no seat. Yes, sir. Sold. The auctioneer moved on before anyone could reconsider. Howard paid his $40 and arranged for Oliver to be loaded onto his flatbed trailer. 2 men helped him push it. The wheels rolled, but barely, the bearings dry and grinding after 13 years without grease. On the drive home, Howard stopped at a gas station in Decatur. The attendant came out, looked at Oliver on the trailer, and shook his head. That thing worth fixing? Howard looked at it in the rearview mirror. I don't know yet. The attendant went back inside. Howard drove home. Let me tell you about Howard Beckett. Because the $40 he spent that Thursday morning only makes sense if you understand the 63 years that came before it. Howard was born in 1908 in Macon County, the third son of a tenant farmer named Arthur Beckett who worked other people's ground his whole life and never owned an acre of his own. Arthur was a good farmer but a poor mechanic, and on a tenant farm, when the equipment broke, you paid to have it fixed or you did without, and neither option was something Arthur could easily afford. Howard had decided at the age of 12 that he would learn to fix things himself, not because anyone taught him, but because watching his father pay a mechanic money they didn't have for work Howard believed he could do himself was something he found genuinely painful. He started teaching himself from farm manuals borrowed from the county library. He took apart a broken reaper in his father's barn, studied how it worked, put it back together. It worked. He did it again with a disc harrow, then an older tractor, then anything mechanical that came within reach of his curiosity. By the time Howard was 20, he was the best mechanic in the county. Not the most trained, not the most credentialed, but the most capable. He could diagnose a problem by sound and feel before he opened the hood. He had developed the particular intelligence of a man who has spent years understanding how things work at the level of individual parts and how those parts relate to each other. He bought his first farm in 1942, 80 acres of decent Macon County ground, using savings from 12 years of work and a small inheritance from an uncle he'd barely known. He bought a 1938 Oliver 99 to work it, used and paid cash. He kept Oliver running for 22 years. When people asked him how, he said he listened to it. Not a poetic answer, a literal one. He listened to the engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, hearing not just what was there, but what wasn't, noticing the sounds that shouldn't exist and the sounds that should but didn't. He could hear a bearing beginning to fail 300 hours before it gave out. He could hear a valve train wearing thin in the particular quality of the engine's breathing. He fixed things before they broke, which meant they almost never broke, which meant Oliver ran, year after year, long past the point where other farmers had moved on to newer iron. This was the man who paid $40 for a rusted 1937 Oliver in June of 1971 and took it home on a flatbed. There was one more thing about Howard that explained everything. He had a rule, not a spoken rule, not something he'd ever written down or told anyone. A rule he lived by the way a man lives by the things he learned young and never forgot. The rule was this: never decide what something is worth before you understand what it is. He had watched too many men at auctions and farm sales dismiss things on appearance. They saw rust and called it worthless. They saw age and called it obsolete. They saw stillness and called it dead. They made their decisions in 10 seconds based on 10 years of accumulated assumptions, and they walked away from things that a different kind of attention would have seen differently. Howard's attention was different. It always has been. His neighbor, a man named Frank Tillman, came over to look at it the following Saturday. Frank was 51 years old and had farmed the adjacent 120 acres for 25 years with a succession of John Deere tractors, each one newer and larger than the last, each one bought on credit from the dealer in Decatur. Frank walked around Oliver slowly. He lifted the hood, looked at the engine, lowered it. He crouched down and looked at the frame rails. He stood up and looked at Howard. Howard, that engine's probably seized solid. It's been sitting for 13 years. Might be. The tires are gone, seats gone. The steering wheel's cracked. I can see that. Frank pushed his cap back. What are you going to do with it? Howard was quiet for a moment. Find out what's wrong with it. Frank looked at Oliver again. I know what's wrong with it. Everything. That's not how I look at a machine. Frank shook his head slowly. He had known Howard Beckett for 15 years and had long since stopped trying to understand how the man's mind worked when it came to old equipment. He'd seen Howard bring back things that other men had given up on. He'd borrowed Howard's rebuilt cultivator 3 seasons running. He knew better than to argue. But this one, Frank said, this one might be past it. Howard looked at Oliver. Maybe, but I haven't looked inside yet. Frank drove away. Howard went to get his tools. Let me tell you about what Howard found when he opened that hood for the first time in 1971, because this is where the story begins to turn. The 6-cylinder engine was indeed seized. 13 years of sitting had done what 13 years of sitting always does: turned the oil to thick, dark sludge, allowed moisture to work its way past the rings and corrode the cylinder walls, fused the pistons to the bores in a grip that a lesser man would have called permanent. Howard did not call it permanent. He pulled his head first. This was always the first step, understanding what you were dealing with before committing to anything. The head came off slowly, reluctantly, the old bolts fighting him one by one. But they came. Howard set the head on his workbench and looked at the combustion chambers. Clean. Not surface clean, not wiped down clean, but genuinely, substantially clean in a way that a 13-year-old engine with seized pistons had no business being. The carbon deposits were minimal. The valve seats were in good condition. The head gasket showed no signs of the coolant intrusion or combustion leaking that almost always accompanied long-term seizure. Someone had taken care of this engine, not recently but historically. Throughout its working life, Someone had maintained this Oliver 70 with attention and precision. Howard checked the oil passages. Clear, he checked the water jacket. No scale buildup, no mineral deposits of the kind that accumulated in engines run on hard water without proper treatment. He began to think the seizure might not be as deep as he'd feared. He poured penetrating oil down the cylinder bores and left it for 3 days. Then he applied carefully, measured pressure to the pistons with a wooden block and a mallet, working each one gently, a quarter turn of the crankshaft at a time, feeling for movement, listening for the quality of the resistance. On the 4th day, the crankshaft turned. Not freely, not easily, but it turned. One labored rotation that told Howard everything he needed to know. The engine wasn't seized in the catastrophic sense. The rings had stuck to the walls from corrosion, not from metal-to-metal seizure. There was a difference, a significant difference, between those two conditions. Stuck rings could be freed. Metal-to-metal seizure usually meant a rebuilt block or a replacement engine. Howard worked the penetrating oil in for 2 more weeks, turning the engine a little further each day, feeling it loosen incrementally. By the end of the 2nd week, the crankshaft turned through a full rotation with only moderate resistance. He drove to the library in Decatur and found the Oliver service manual for the 1937 model year. The library didn't have it, but the librarian called the State Agricultural Library in Champaign, who had it on microfilm. Howard drove to Champaign, photographed every page he needed, and drove home. He knew what the engine should be. Now he would find out how close it still was. The work took 14 months. Howard rebuilt the engine completely, not because every part needed replacement, but because a complete rebuild was the only way to know exactly what you had. He measured every clearance, every tolerance, every dimension against the specifications in the Oliver manual. Most things were within acceptable range. Some things needed attention. A few things needed replacement. He found replacement parts through a combination of sources, some from Oliver dealers who still carried antique inventory, some from a salvage yard in Missouri that specialized in pre-war farm equipment. He machined himself in the small workshop behind his barn where he kept his father's old metal lathe, bought at an estate sale in 1955, and maintained with the same care Howard gave everything mechanical. The rings he found at a piston shop in Bloomington that could manufacture them to specification from Howard's measurements. The carburetor he rebuilt from a kit, replacing every rubber component and cleaning every passage with wire and solvent until the fuel flow was exactly what the manual said it should be. He rebuilt the magneto from scratch, winding new coils on the armature with wire he ordered from an electrical supply house in Chicago. He replaced the fuel lines, the coolant hoses, the belts. He found an original Oliver seat at a farm sale in Champaign County, the correct style for a 1937 model, cracked but repairable with careful work. He sourced tires from an agricultural tire supplier in St. Louis, the correct size for the rear axle, the correct width for the front spindles. The steering wheel he rebuilt himself, cleaning the cracks in the Bakelite, filling them with epoxy mixed to match the original color, sanding them smooth. Not factory original, but correct in proportion and feel. He painted it last, Oliver green, the correct shade, mixed at a paint shop in Decatur from a formula he'd found in a pre-war Oliver catalog at the State Library. Not the faded rust green of the machine he'd bought. The deep, confident green of a machine that was new in 1937 and intended to work for decades. He painted it last, Oliver green, the correct shade, mixed at a paint shop in Decatur from a formula he'd found in a pre-war Oliver catalog at the State Library. Not the faded rust green of the machine he'd bought. The deep, confident green of a machine that was new in 1937 and intended to work for decades. He did not rush the paint. He applied 3 coats, sanding between each one, the way a man paints something he intends to keep. He re-stenciled the Oliver name on the hood in the original font, working from a photograph he'd found in a 1937 farm equipment catalog at the County Historical Society. He polished the cast-iron manifold until it held a dull shine. He cleaned and relacquered the instrument panel, replacing the cracked glass on the oil pressure gauge with a piece cut from a watch crystal he found at a jeweler's shop in Decatur. These were not practical improvements. The tractor ran without a polished manifold. It worked without a correct font on the hood. Howard did them because he believed that a machine that had been built with care deserved to be restored with care. That cutting corners at the end was a form of disrespect to everyone who had put their hands on it before him: the Oliver engineers in Charles City who had designed it, the craftsman who had assembled it, and the farmer who had maintained it so carefully before parking it in 1958. He did not know who that farmer was. He had tried to find out. The county deed records showed 3 owners between 1937 and 1958, and he had tracked down relatives of the last 2, but nobody could tell him much. The last owner's daughter, a woman in her 70s living in Peoria, remembered the tractor vaguely from her childhood. She said her father had kept it in the back of the barn and rarely let anyone work on it. She said he'd called it his good one without explaining what that meant. Howard thought about that phrase for a long time. His good one. Someone had known. Someone had understood that this particular Oliver was different from the others and had treated it accordingly, had maintained it with the precision that the development engine deserved, had sealed it before parking it, protecting the crankcase from the moisture that would have destroyed the bearings over 13 years of Illinois winters. His good one. Howard thought the original owner had probably never known the specific reason why it was his good one, had never known about the development engine or the modified combustion chamber geometry or the Smithsonian archive. But he had known, in the way that men who listen to machines know things, that this Oliver was something apart from the ordinary. He had been right, and now it was Howard's turn to be right about it. In August of 1972, 14 months after he'd paid $40 for a rusted hulk on a flatbed trailer, Howard Beckett drove the Oliver 70 out of his barn under its own power. The 6-cylinder engine ran with the particular smoothness that had given the Oliver 70 its reputation in 1937, quiet for its displacement, even in its power delivery. The kind of engine that seemed to be working less hard than it actually was, which was the sign of something built right and maintained right and rebuilt right. Frank Tillman was at his fence line when Howard drove past on the county road. Frank watched Oliver go by, green and straight and running, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I'll be damned." Howard stopped the tractor. Frank walked to the fence. "How long did that take you?" 14 months. Frank looked at Oliver, at the paint, at the tires, at the engine running clean under the rebuilt hood. "What did it cost you altogether?" Howard thought about it. 40 for the tractor. Parts and materials, maybe 350. Call it 400 total. Frank's newest John Deere had cost him $11,000, financed over 5 years. He looked at Oliver running in front of him and couldn't quite find anything to say. Howard put the tractor in gear and drove back to his farm. Now let me tell you about what happened when Howard used Oliver for the next 8 years. Because the rebuild was remarkable. What Oliver did after the rebuild was something else entirely. Howard put the 1937 Oliver into regular service on his 80 acres. He used it for planting and cultivation and light tillage work, tasks that suited its power range and its age. The tractor was 34 years old when he rebuilt it. By farming standards, by any reasonable standard, it should have been a museum piece, not a working machine. It didn't act like a museum piece. The 6-cylinder engine, freed from its 13-year sleep and rebuilt to specification, produced the power the Oliver engineers had designed it to produce in 1937. 35 horsepower at the drawbar. Not impressive by 1972 standards, not compared to the new tractors coming off the line with 60 and 80 and 100 horsepower, but enough for what Howard needed it to do. More importantly, it ran. Every morning when Howard went to the barn, it started. Not easily, not always on the first attempt in cold weather, but reliably, consistently. Without the drama of unexpected failure that plagued equipment pressed beyond its design limits or maintained below its requirements. Howard maintained it the way the man who had originally owned it had maintained it, with attention and precision and the understanding that a machine well cared for gives back more than it takes. Frank Tillman's John Deere threw a hydraulic pump in the spring of 1974. He was down for 9 days waiting for parts. Howard lent him Oliver for 2 of those days, and Frank used it without complaint, which was as close to a compliment as Frank generally got. The farm crisis hit Macon County hard in the early 1980s. Howard watched his neighbors struggle with debt that had made sense when commodity prices were high and made no sense at all when they weren't. He watched Frank Tillman refinance his operation twice, reducing the term on one loan to make room for another, the financial equivalent of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Howard had no loans. Oliver had cost him $400. His other equipment was similarly acquired, similarly rehabilitated, similarly owned outright. He could ride out the crisis the way the old machine had ridden out 13 years in a barn, without moving, without making demands, simply waiting for conditions to change. They changed. Howard was still farming when they did. There was a moment in the spring of 1983 that Howard didn't talk about much but didn't forget. He was at the grain elevator in Decatur when he ran into a man named Carl Westover, who had farmed 600 acres on the east side of the county. Carl was one of the farmers Howard had watched expand during the boom years, buying land at inflated prices, financing equipment he couldn't have afforded to pay cash for. Carl had been, in the mid-1970s, the kind of farmer that other farmers pointed to as an example of what success looked like. Howard had not pointed to Carl as an example of anything, but he hadn't said so out loud. Now Carl was standing at the elevator counter with the expression of a man who has just come from a meeting at the bank that did not go the way he needed it to go. His face had the specific quality of someone carrying a weight that he can no longer pretend is manageable. They exchanged a few words. Howard asked about Carl's season. Carl said it wasn't good. Howard said he was sorry to hear it. Carl looked at him for a moment. "You're not carrying any debt, are you, Howard?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," Howard said. Carl nodded slowly. "I should have done that. Should have stayed small. Should have paid cash and stayed small and not listened to every banker in the county telling me it was a good time to grow." Howard didn't know what to say to that. Carl said, "You know what the worst part is? When it all made sense, when I was signing the papers, the numbers all worked, the projections made sense, the banker was confident, the land prices were going up every year. It seemed like the obvious thing to do." He shook his head. "Seemed like a careful thing to do." Howard thought about that word. Careful. He thought about $40 at an auction and 400 in parts and 15 years of owning something outright. He said, "I think being careful means different things depending on what you're afraid of." Carl looked at him. "What were you afraid of?" Howard thought about it honestly. "Owing someone for something I couldn't pay back. That's what I was always afraid of. More than missing out on something, more than falling behind, more than any of the other things that are supposed to make a man afraid." Carl was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's a reasonable thing to be afraid of." He drove away. Howard finished his business at the elevator and drove home past his 80 acres, and Oliver sat in the open shed where he'd parked it after morning chores. Owing someone for something he couldn't pay back. Oliver had cost him $40 and 400 in parts. He had owed no one for it since the day he loaded it on the flatbed. Whatever else happened, whatever the corn market did or the interest rates did or the land values did, that machine was his. Completely and without condition his. That was what $40 had bought him, in the end. Not just a tractor, not just a story. Ownership without condition. The ability to stand in a bad year and say, "This is mine, and it will still be mine when this year is over." He drove past Oliver and into his barn. "Let me tell you about 1985, because 1985 is when Oliver's last secret came out, 14 years after Howard had brought it home on a flatbed, and 48 years after it had rolled off the line in Charles City. Howard was doing his annual pre-winter teardown, the ritual inspection he performed on every piece of equipment before cold storage, checking everything, replacing anything that showed wear, leaving nothing to chance over the winter months. He had done this with Oliver every year since 1972. He knew every bolt, every casting, every machine surface on that engine. This year, cleaning the underside of the engine block, he found something he had never noticed before, a stamped marking on the casting. Not the serial number, he knew where that was, had recorded it years ago. This was something else. On the opposite side of the block from the serial number, in a location that was invisible unless the engine was completely clean and you were specifically looking at that area of the casting. The marking was a series of letters and numbers. Howard copied them into his notebook and spent the winter researching. What he found took him 6 months to fully understand, involving letters to the Oliver Corporation's Historical Records Office, a conversation with a retired Oliver engineer he located through the company's Alumni Association, and a visit to the Smithsonian Institution's Agricultural History Archive in Washington, where a curator named Dr. Patricia Cole spent 3 hours going through records with him. The Oliver 70 Howard had bought for $40 had been a prototype, not a production prototype, not one of the early models built before the design was finalized. Something more specific than that. In 1936, before the Oliver 70 went into full production, the engineering team at Charles City had built a small number of development engines, less than a dozen, with a modified combustion chamber geometry that the engineers believed would produce better fuel efficiency at low throttle settings. The modification was subtle, measurable only in the precise dimensions of the combustion chamber and the angle of the valve seats. The development engines were tested, and the results were positive, but the modification required a change to the casting tooling that would have cost more to implement than the fuel efficiency improvement was worth at the scale of production. The engineers documented the results, shelved the modification, and the standard combustion chamber went into production. The development engines were sold. They went into standard production tractors, indistinguishable from the outside, identified only by the stamped marking on the block that recorded their engineering provenance. Howard's Oliver 70 was one of them. Dr. Cole at the Smithsonian confirmed it. Of the 11 development engines documented in the Oliver records, only 4 had been accounted for in the historical record. Howard's machine was the 5th known example, and based on its condition, running, complete with all original major components, it was almost certainly the best preserved. Howard drove home from Washington and walked out to his barn and stood next to Oliver for a long time. He thought about the man who had originally owned this tractor, someone who had maintained it with exceptional care, who had sealed the engine before storage, who had somehow understood that this was a machine worth preserving. He never found out who that person was. The trail from the 1937 sale to the 1958 parking and the 1971 auction ran through ownership records that were incomplete and memories that were gone. He thought about the $40 he'd paid at auction while other men walked past without looking. He thought about 14 months of work in a barn, measuring tolerances and winding coils and mixing paint. He thought about what Frank Tillman had said when Oliver first drove past his fence line. "I'll be damned." He thought about the Oliver 70 development program record in the Smithsonian archive, and his tractor's number in the column of documented examples, and the curator's voice saying, "Mr. Beckett, do you understand what you have?" He did now. Let me tell you about the conversation Howard had with Frank Tillman that winter, because it is the conversation that this whole story has been building toward. Howard walked over to Frank's place on a Sunday afternoon in December of 1985 and sat down at Frank's kitchen table with a folder of documents from the Smithsonian and the Oliver Records Office. He laid them out and explained what he'd found. Frank read the documents carefully. He was not a quick reader, but he was a thorough one, and when he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Howard for a long time. Then he said, "What's it worth?" Howard said he didn't know exactly. He'd had a conversation with a collector in Indiana who specialized in pre-war Oliver equipment. The collector had said that a running, original 1937 Oliver 70 in restored condition was worth somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 to the right buyer. A documented development engine example, provably original, with the Smithsonian records to support it, was worth considerably more than that. He'd used the word considerably more than once. Frank was quiet. He thought about the $40 Howard had paid at auction in 1971. He thought about the $400 total Howard had spent to restore it. He thought about his own $11,000 John Deere, bought on credit in 1978, worth maybe $4,000 now after the crisis had flattened equipment values. He thought about watching Oliver drive past his fence line in August of 1972 and not finding anything to say. "Howard," Frank said finally, "I walked past that tractor at the auction. I know. I saw the tag. 37 Oliver, as is, no known running condition. I remember. I kept walking." Frank looked at his hands on the table. "You stood there for 11 minutes and then paid $40 for something I didn't look at twice." Howard didn't say anything. Frank said, "What did you see that I didn't?" Howard thought about the question for a moment. He thought about his father watching the mechanic work on machinery they couldn't afford to have repaired. He thought about 12 years old and a broken reaper in a barn and the decision to understand how it worked. He thought about 63 years of listening to engines the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. "I didn't see anything specific," he said. "I just didn't assume I knew what it was before I looked at it." Frank was quiet. "I stopped making assumptions about machines a long time ago," Howard said. "Every machine has a story. Most people read the cover and walk away. I wanted to know what was inside this one." Frank looked at the documents on his table, the Smithsonian records, the Oliver engineering notes, the curator's letter confirming the development engine provenance. "You paid $40 to find out what was inside it. $40 and 14 months. Frank picked up his coffee mug, and what was inside it was something nobody knew existed. Howard nodded. "That's usually how it works. The things worth finding are the ones nobody's looked for yet." Howard sold Oliver in 1987 to the collector in Indiana he'd spoken with. The final price, negotiated over 3 meetings and 1 phone call, was $22,000. The collector had the Smithsonian documentation authenticated independently, conferred with 2 other Oliver historians, and agreed that the development engine provenance made Howard's machine genuinely significant. $22,000. Howard had paid $40 in 1971. He had spent $400 total. He had used the tractor for 15 years. He thought about what was fair to keep and what was fair to do with, and he made a decision that took him about as long as the decision to bid $40 at the auction, which was to say not very long at all. He put 15,000 of the 22 into a fund that helped the children of 3 neighboring farmers who had lost their operations in the crisis attend the agricultural college in Champaign. He kept the rest. He didn't say anything about it publicly. The families who received the help knew where it came from, eventually, and Frank Tillman knew because Howard told him, and that was enough. Let me tell you one more thing, because there is one more thing that belongs in this story. Frank Tillman changed after that winter, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the direction of a man who has learned something true and is trying to act on it. He stopped buying on credit. Not immediately. He had existing loans to manage, but he stopped adding to them. He started looking at his equipment differently, asking what it needed rather than what it was worth, learning to maintain rather than replace. He bought a 1949 Oliver 88 at an auction in 1988, running but rough, for $600. He brought it to Howard, who was 79 years old by then and working more slowly but with the same precise attention he had always brought to mechanical things. Howard spent 3 weekends going through the 88 with Frank beside him, explaining what he was looking at, why he was looking at it, what the measurements told him and what the sounds told him and what the specific quality of the resistance told him when he turned something by hand. Frank paid attention in a way he hadn't paid attention to anything mechanical before. By the end of the 3 weekends, the 88 was running cleanly and Frank understood something about how it worked that he had never understood about any of the machines he'd owned in 30 years of farming. He also understood something else. The $40 Howard had spent in 1971 was not luck. It was not eccentricity. It was not the random result of a man with too much patience and too little sense. It was the natural consequence of paying attention to things that other people had decided were not worth their attention. The Oliver had been there. It had always been there. $40 on a flatbed at the edge of an auction lot, carrying a development engine from 1936 and a history that nobody had thought to look for. Howard had looked. That was all the difference. That was the whole story. A man who looked at things before deciding what they were. A machine that was worth more than anyone imagined, waiting for someone to imagine it. $40, 14 months, 50 years of not knowing what was under the hood. And then one morning in a barn in Macon County, Illinois, a mechanic who had been listening to engines his whole life opened the hood of a rusted 1937 Oliver and found something extraordinary. Not because it was hidden, because he was the first person to look.